I have really enjoyed our choir during this Holy Week. They have worked so hard, have brought special music to all of our Holy Week services, and we're so proud of them. Thank you for sharing the gospel and music this morning. The Gospel of Matthew joins the other three gospel writers in noting the fact that nobody actually witnessed the resurrection of Jesus. He said the authorities placed a guard there at the tomb to prevent anyone from stealing the body because they feared that was what was about to happen, that there would be some sort of a plot to make it seem as though Jesus had not died. And so they stationed 2 Roman soldiers there. And they were there then, the 2 soldiers. But they did not witness the resurrection. They were either asleep or struck unconscious by the force of it, which is what Matthew suggests. Or maybe they just blinked and it happened, but they did not see it. They were sort of like those prison guards who discover pillows under the blanket and the prisoner is gone. And then came the 2 Marys to the garden that morning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. That's what Matthew says, whoever she was. But we know they were part of the band of women who followed him from Galilee all the way down to Jerusalem, stayed with him all the way. They were there at the cross when he died, the women. The disciples all fled except for the one that Jesus loved. But the women stayed all the way to the end, and they are still around as evidenced by their coming to the tomb on the 3rd day as mourners visiting the grave. But they did not witness the resurrection either. They missed it too. They got there too late. It had already happened. Instead, what they see is an angel sitting there on a rock, Matthew says. But did you hear it? Did you hear what the angel said to them? The same thing that Jesus says to them in a few moments. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen. Come and see the place where he lay. And then go and quickly tell the disciples he is risen from the dead. Now that's our text. And notice it begins, do not be afraid. The last time we heard those words from an angel was at Christmas in Luke's gospel. There an angel appeared to Mary, remember? Mary, the mother of Jesus, and announced to her that she would bear a son. And then he said, do not be afraid, for the Lord is with you. And then an angel appeared to the shepherds out in the field, abiding their flocks by night. And what did the angel say? Do not be afraid, for I bring you glad tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. You see, when an angel appears in the Bible and says, do not be afraid, something's about to happen. It really means you better stand back because God is about to act in a special way. And it's going to be good news. Glad tidings of great joy. That's called a literary device. It's a clue to interpreting the Bible. It means that if it happens in one event, when it happens in another event, it will have exactly the same meaning as it had the first time. But when an angel appears and says, do not be afraid, it means that what happened at the resurrection is exactly what happened at the nativity. God is intervening to redeem the world. He's intervening because the world cannot save itself. In fact, the world doesn't even want to be redeemed. Christmas time, they tried to shut him out, and so he was born in a stable. On Good Friday, they tried to do away with him, and so he was resurrected from the dead. You see, when an angel appears and says, don't be afraid, you better stand back, because God is about to act in a special way to accomplish his will for the world, even if the world doesn't want it. What's amazing about all this is not that God intervenes. They expected that God would intervene. They prayed for it. They wanted God to intervene like the Terminator. You know, fed up with all the evil in the world, wiping out the bad guys, trashing the place. But in each instance, at Christmas and at Easter, he intervened, but he intervened quietly and gently. He came not to destroy, but to redeem. Not to put an end to the world, but to give the world new life. And that's really amazing when you stop and think about it, which is what we're supposed to do today, of all days. We're supposed to think about the resurrection and what it means to us. And Matthew says that Easter was like Christmas, in that God came meekly, not with chariots, but on dove's wings, not in retribution, but in reconciliation, not with fire and power, but with forgiveness. And in each event, he entrusted this magnificent news of what was happening to humble people. People you would never expect. A peasant girl, shepherds, and then at Easter to Mary Magdalene, a woman of questionable reputation, and the other Mary, whoever she was. He came so humbly as to be invisible, incognito, except to those who believed, except to those who were humble enough themselves to hear the angels saying, "Do not be afraid. For unto you a child is born," or "Do not be afraid, he is not here. He is risen." I wonder if that's what bothers some of us about it. It was so invisible. The angel says, "Come and see," but what they saw was an empty tomb and some linen cloths. All kinds of people saw that. And when the authorities got the news, they came rushing out to the graveyard to see it for themselves. They drew their own conclusion. The Romans said, well, it's a plot. They said what they feared was going to happen had happened. You see, the most common rumor about the resurrection in those days was that the disciples themselves had stolen the body. They saw and drew their own conclusion. "Come and see," the angel says, but all you could see was the empty tomb. And that's all we can see too. The rest is faith. The historical fact is the empty tomb. That is a matter of history. But the resurrection is an act of faith for those who believe. Though if you want hard evidence before you believe, you're never going to be satisfied. We are trained to have hard evidence. We are trained to weigh the facts, see for ourselves, have some visible proof before we believe. And all that Easter offers us is an empty tomb and some linen cloths lying there. And later on, some appearances by someone who people did not even really recognize at first. Just the evidence that something has happened. Like seeing footprints or traces or tracks or evidence that something happened here. And there are a lot of people in this world who can't accept that because it's a matter of faith. There are some in this world who see themselves as worldly, and it's just not enough evidence. But you know something? The world is changing. And the way we look upon the world that we live in is changing too. And the scientists will tell you that we are seeing more and more mystery in it. The more we know we don't know. The astronomer K.C. Cole, in an article about this, said, "What we were certain about, we now question." He said Einstein will one day be proven wrong just as he himself proved Isaac Newton wrong. And then he said this, quote, "But in another sense, they will both be right, because this world is becoming bigger than we thought it was. There is more mystery than we ever assumed. Science is discovering that this universe has an immensity we cannot even comprehend. There are parts of this world, the immense parts of this world, that just don't fit into human logic." And he goes on to explain that we have extremely sophisticated instruments with which we have come to measure the universe. But the more sophisticated the instrument, the more information it gathers. And the more information it gathers, the more complex the universe becomes. So now you have to say what Paul said 2,000 years ago to the Corinthians. We only see in part. We don't see the whole. We see through a glass dimly. Now we know in part, Paul said. That's the human condition. We only see in part. And we are discovering there's an awful lot going on here that we can't see at all. That has been discovered by molecular scientists examining the smallest item that there is, the atom. That's what I was taught when I grew up in school, that the atom was the smallest building block of all matter, or at least it was thought to be the smallest thing, because the word atom in the Greek means indivisible. You can't divide it anymore. But now, with these sophisticated instruments, we are discovering the atom is not the smallest thing. In fact, inside every atom, there's a whole universe. Now that will blow your mind if you think about it. And moving around in this universe are all kinds of matter that we didn't even know existed 50 years ago. We call them particles. And the scientists give them exotic names like quarks. But this is the fascinating part to me. This is the mystery. We can't even see these particles, but we know they're there because what we can see is the traces of them. We see their footprints. It is evidence that something was there, but we can't see it. It's like the two Marys who did not see God's intervention, just the trace of it, the tracks, the empty tomb, the linen cloths. And maybe, just maybe, God is as mysterious as this magnificent universe that he's created. Maybe we're allowed to see what he has done, but not the way he does it. And then, according to Matthew, the final instruction to the two women: go and tell the disciples that he has risen from the dead. I suppose that's the answer to the question, well, what should we do in the face of all this? Go and tell the disciples that he has risen from the dead. That became the mission of the church, you see. It is still the mission of the church. We are to go and tell what happened at Easter, and to tell what meaning it has for the world. And you can see how the early church did that. You turn to the book of Acts or Paul's letters, or finally go all the way to the end of the Bible, the last book, the Revelation to St. John, and you'll find it there. This is what happened. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, as instructed, told the disciples, he is risen. The disciples, in turn, told others, he is risen. And in turn, they told others. And then they all gathered to discover what this meant. And they weren't sure, not completely. In fact, Matthew says some of them doubted. But they did know this: this world would never be the same again. Never. The kingdom that he had preached and he instructed us to pray for, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, had come, at least in the beginning, as the very first rays of the sun herald the coming of a new day. And so they began to live as though that new day were here. They began to live as though the kingdom were here. And the first thing the world noticed about these early Christians was their irrepressible joy. They rejoiced in all the wrong places. They rejoiced in all the most inappropriate places, like prison cells. In all the wrong times, like at funerals. They took the Greek laurel wreath of victory and placed it on top of the graves of the faithful who had died. And they also noticed they were so much more optimistic than the occasion warranted. All the evidence there in the first century pointed to despair. It was not a good time, neither in Palestine, where the church began, or throughout the Roman Empire, where it began to spread. And all the smart people, all the sophisticated people in that world were pessimistic. They said things like the fates are capricious and the gods are indifferent, but not the Christians. They were always optimistic. They said things like, if God is for us, who can be against us? And we are more than conquerors through the one who loved us. And the other thing they noticed about these Christians is they began to create a community that was so different from the rest of the world. They created a community that they believed Jesus wanted to have created in this world. And Paul put it in his letter to the Galatians. Now there is neither Jew nor Greek, male or female, slave or free, but we are all one in Christ Jesus. In the world, you see, laws and customs separate us. In the world, there's permanent segregation, and it had always been that way. But in the church, we're all one in Christ Jesus. And finally, because the kingdom was here, they knew in their heart that God wins in the end. They looked forward to that time when all the enemies of life would be defeated once and for all. And so the final thing the world noticed about these early Christians was their amazing hope that led them to say that one day the kingdoms of this world will become the kingdoms of our Christ. That one day every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, and he will reign forever and forever. And you can see it during those times of persecution they went through. And it was in such a time that a man named John, who was probably a bishop in Asia Minor, on the prison at Patmos, an island in the Mediterranean, had a dream one day. And he dreamed of that day when the kingdom would be here in all its fullness. And it would be the world God wanted it to be. And this is what he said. I saw a new heaven, new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven, a bride prepared for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne that said, behold, the dwelling place of God is with human beings, and he will come and dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. And listen, death will be no more. Neither shall there be mourning or crying or pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. Do not be afraid. Come and see, and then go and tell.